reasons I generally try to focus on lesser used mobile suits in Gundam Battle Academy is to raise awareness on suits that may be more than they initially appear to be. Sometimes I'll cover ones that still have their own devoted fanbase, like the Gouf Custom, and other times I'll cover one that absolutely nobody expected to be good, like today's entry. This one is by far the rarest Gouf that is currently in use right now, the Gouf Heavy Arms. While it first showed up in MSV, most people are more familiar with its appearance in Unicorn, where it was used during the Torrington Base Assault, or rather, where it would have, had it actually made it to the front line. The Gouf Heavy Arms never actually made it to the battle. In fact, that was something that probably saved its pilot's life. In fact, the pilot would later go on to shore up the retreat from the Torrington Base Assault after that assault failed. In GBO2, the Gouf Heavy Arms is a 300-point ground-only general. It is also ground specialized, and it's one of only 2 Goufs that is specifically range-focused. It's definitely the most unusual one in terms of combat style. For those who are familiar with the early days of GBO2, I can kind of compare running into one as being about as rare as running into a Recon Zaku. And while the Recon Zaku was eventually added to the rest of the drop pools, the Gouf Heavy Arms is a relatively recent addition because it was originally a clan match reward. The other reasons that you don't see it that often are that it's specifically 300 points, it was then an event reward, and most critically, it comes out in the exact same cost bracket as the Gouf VD. And while we will be covering our boy the VD in an upcoming video, we are going to have to touch on it, at least a bit, today. The reason why is because the Gouf VD is one of the most powerful 300 pointers. Very strong melee with a unique moveset, decent overall stats, emergency evasion 2, an extremely ubiquitous primary weapon in the giant bazooka, and access to all the shiniest toys from the Gouf Custom. In contrast, the Gouf Heavy Arms is a much harder sell. While it is notably better armored and significantly tougher than the VD, it is also substantially slower, being barely faster than the Zaku 1GS. It also lacks emergency evasion entirely, making it the only general Gouf to not have that skill. It is also even worse in close combat than the Gouf Light Test Type, and since we're comparing it to that suit, if you took a look at the Gouf Heavy Arms, you probably thought the same thing everyone who saw this suit originally thought. Namely, oh hey, it's a flightless Gouf Flight Test Type. Thankfully, this is not the case. While it does have the same primary, and it does have the same melee weapon, in practice it uses a wildly different combat style, mostly focused on one of its secondaries. So if you're giving up that much, obviously you must be getting back something in return. So the question is, what? And the answer happens to be firepower. We will get into its secondary weapons in a bit, because leading off, we have to get into its primary weapon choices. Leading off, it has its own unique version of the Gouf Finger Gun. The one on the Heavy Arms has slightly longer range, slightly more ammo, and does slightly more damage. It's also slightly more accurate. On maps with closer in fighting, this may actually be the better option in a few cases. Also, like the Gouf MG it happens to be based on, it does 50% more damage to parts. However, it's not a unilateral upgrade. It fires a little slower than the stock Gouf MG, and it's weaker at accumulation stagger, requiring 25 hits to do it. That second downside is a bit less of an issue, mostly because, at least on the Gouf Heavy Arms, you will never be using that weapon to inflict stagger. Instead, the big advantage is that this weapon gives you a very good plinking tool you can use on the move, and it does have slightly better internal synergy with the rest of the Gouf Heavy Arms' kit. The other primary weapon it gets is the giant bazooka. Again, I have, as of this video, created 7 episodes of Gundam Battle Academy. This weapon has appeared on 4 of those suits so far. But yeah, you know it, you'll love it. It's a stock bazooka with no frills and no bullshit. Certainly the more straightforward of the 2 choices, and definitely the one with better range. Its melee weapon is blow, and it has very high modifiers, so even though it's kind of a bad weapon, it's usable. Weapon number 3 is a Sturmfaust, another perennial favorite of Gundam Battle Academy. If you are not familiar with the secondary weapon, it is basically a shorter range bazooka on call. It's weapon number 4 on the Gouf Heavy Arms that's the moneymaker though. The 5-barrel Finger Vulcan in discharge mode. You're probably looking at this and thinking to yourself, oh, it's a machine gun, right? Like the Gouf FTT? No. This is a volley gun, which means it fires every single bullet at once. That is 10 bullets at more or less the stock strength of the basic finger gun it uses. This weapon does amazing accumulation stagger, offering most of the benefits of a shotgun, but with vastly longer range. But the real big ticket? It fires once a second. You can't fire it on the move. There's a bit of scatter to it, so the shots rarely land dead center. You're fairly vulnerable when trying to use it, and its range is relatively short. None of that matters. Unless the target that you're firing at has particularly high ballistic defense or it's a support, it will go down in one magazine of this thing, provided the suit's in the same cost bracket, of course. In terms of DPS, it is the single strongest weapon at 300 points. No exceptions. As a result, a major component of getting the most mileage out of this suit is mastering both the positioning and timing to maximize your damage output and make it harder for enemies to stop you from doing your thing. And, by coincidence, also making it harder for allies to stop you from doing your thing. Because believe me, they will constantly steer into your path with this thing active. Because even though it's 2023, my joke about GBO2 being my favorite 11v1 team game remains alive and well. To properly use this weapon, you have to get direct line of sight on an enemy at relatively close range and keep them there for the entire duration. If they do not have damage control or emergency evasion, odds are good you will basically shuffle lock them for the entire thing. Smarter ones will realize what you're doing and try to steer out of it or tackle out of it, but otherwise, it's simply a matter of getting into position and doing your thing. Mom said I could be anything when I grew up, so I decided to be a shilka. In this regard, using it is a lot like using a suit with a shrapnel bazooka. If you're not familiar with using one of these flak machines, imagine a stock bazooka with a much higher fire rate that has each explosion spray confetti everywhere, and the confetti is buckshot. Shrapnel bazookas have a couple of quirks, namely that you have to get a sweet spot hit for ideal damage. That's where the enemy is in perfect range, so you hit him with both the shell and the subsequent explosion and the shrapnel. The dual finger gun discharge on the Gouf Heavy Arms is basically a similar strategy, but way more reliable. The obvious downsides are the short range and the fact that you are planted to the ground while using this thing due to the recoil. To get around this, the Gouf Heavy Arms is an almost ideal flanking general. A lot like the GM Cold Districts type, it focuses heavily on one primary weapon, and it has maneuver armor rather than emergency evasion. It's a combination of a bazooka, or a machine gun, and a relatively bad melee weapon that for some reason also has really good downswing damage, making it a really good emergency close combat option that actually covers a bit of ground. Makes it fairly good in breakthrough operations. It's actually kind of interesting. Ideally, you use its primary weapon, melee weapon, and Sturmfaust to help you get into position, roll with your teammates, and gradually push up the battle line. Once you get where you're going, pop out the finger guns and get right to work. Your ability to ladle out easy accumulation stagger will be highly appreciated by your teammates, but it will actually be your damage output that's your biggest contribution. Thankfully, your custom parts slot allocation nicely lines up with this. 6 close range slots, 7 medium slots, 7 long range slots. Enough to put in a nice assortment of different parts, mostly durability boosters and firepower boosters. While there is a few suits that could compare to this thing in terms of how its general combat style plays out, basically none managed to completely duplicate its main role. So, where the hell does this thing rate on my tier rankings? At 300, it is absolutely excellent tier. Your main threats in the general bracket will be Bluzooka suits, but it's going to be supports that are going to give you your biggest trouble. They're going to be the suits that even your suit has a lot of trouble dealing with. I'd say the worst threat that you're going to be dealing with at this tier is actually the gun cannon mass production type. On top of having really good firepower, it's just bulky and tough enough that you're not going to be able to burst it down efficiently. You can dump an entire finger gun payload into one of these things and it's still only going to strip off about 70% of its HP tops. For generals, it's really important that you keep an eye out for the Zaku 2 F2 and Zaku 2 FZ. Both can rack you pretty efficiently and easily chain stun you. At 350, good tier. There's only currently a 300 point Gouf Heavy Arms. Thankfully, it's not hugely disadvantaged by going under cost. The big problem is what you start running into here. The Zaku 2 Stutzer, Pale Rider Cavalry, Dom Tropin, Gelgoog, they're all solidly able to engage and outrange you and can easily padlock you if you're not careful. They're also not rooted to the ground by using their best weapon, which you are. That said, once you get into position, still very little stands in the way of your firepower. All of that is enough to land you just on this side of good tier. 400, 4 tier. Using the Gouf Heavy Arms at this tier is really hard to justify. There are just way too many generals that can multitask, supports that can just blow you out of the water, and raids that can just flat out tank what you're trying to do. The Gouf Heavy Arms' relatively poor mobility means that you're very easy to isolate, and your only real defensive feature is Maneuver Armor 1. Now, obviously, if higher level versions of the Gouf Heavy Arms come out, we will eventually see these two brackets move up considerably higher. But for now, 400 is basically as far as I'm willing to take it, and it basically sits comfortably at poor tier at 400. All in all, the Gouf Heavy Arms is a very unusual suit. It doesn't really play like anything else, and it requires a steady hand to get the most out of. But if you're willing to put in the time to actually get good with it, and certainly max it out, there's a lot of potential here. Now, if it only appeared at a cost other than 300. Our tour de force of the Gouf line is almost complete with this particular video, but there's still 2 more left to cover. So stay tuned, and hopefully I'll be able to get that one done sooner rather than later.